The Sahel does not shout when it changes. Its nights hold their breath, and its deserts keep their secrets longer than any uniform ever could. For years, quiet figures moved across outposts and borderlands, their presence spoken of in whispers, their purpose hidden behind shadows and rumor. No banners, no proclamations, only a silent promise of protection in a land that had waited too long. Then a new chapter stirred, a different insignia arrived, a different rhythm entered the camps. And across Ouagadougou, where the voice of Ibrahim Traore carried through tense, expectant air, the question grew louder than any convoy engine. What truly changes when one presence fades into the dusk and another steps into the light? If the old map is being redrawn, who holds the pen? The ground shifts. Stay with this story. And if these questions echo with your own memories, subscribe and walk this road with us. The story begins long before any rebranding, long before the world learned new names for forces that had already shaped the Sahel's nights. Across the wide horizon, movements were rarely announced. Trucks traveled with their lights dimmed, boots pressed into sand that swallowed their traces within hours. For the communities living along the borderlands, presence was always sensed before it was understood. There were men who arrived without flags, who spoke little, who stayed apart from public squares and markets. People described them as a shadow that moved with purpose, yet without the formality that usually accompanies any foreign actor. It was neither myth nor spectacle. It was simply the way things were done when states were strained and old alliances had cracked. What the region saw then was not an army, not exactly a private company, not exactly an official force. It was something in between, a structure made of contracts, secrecy, and sudden appearance. Their role, as understood by those who watched carefully, touched three areas: training, technical assistance, and advisory support to units that struggled under the weight of expanding tensions. In the dusty outskirts of Gao, Mopti, and the northern reaches of the Sahel belt, villagers noticed their routine. Early dawn departures, late-night returns, equipment unfamiliar to local eyes, patterns of movement that suggested both competence and isolation. They rarely interacted with civilians, they rarely offered explanation. Their existence was a response to a vacuum, the kind left behind when international missions withdrew and national armies faced more than they could manage alone. But the Sahel is a place where nothing stays hidden forever. Its winds carry rumors faster than its roads carry trucks. Stories traveled, stories of recruitment, of training grounds in the savannah, of instructors who spoke in brief commands and left no written record. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others were not. All of them fed into a single truth. Something was operating in the margins of official structures, and it was reshaping the way security functioned in the region. Governments, under pressure, leaned on this presence. They sought rapid reinforcement, quick expertise, answers that traditional partners could no longer provide or were unwilling to deliver. For a moment, the arrangement seemed to work. Towns once abandoned by their defenders saw uniforms again. Roads previously deemed impassable were patrolled. Checkpoints reappeared on routes long surrendered to uncertainty. Yet even in moments of tentative stability, the nature of this partnership raised questions. Who commanded? Who authorized? Whose interests were ultimately served? Leadership in the region tried to explain the circumstances. In Ouagadougou, speeches by Ibrahim Traore invoked the necessity of reclaiming security by any means still available, reminding listeners that sovereignty meant choosing whatever tools remained standing when others disappeared. His tone, often calm yet firm, reflected the urgency felt across the Sahel. The need for help, but also the desire not to be owned by any outside force. Still, reliance on entities that operated partly outside transparency carried an unavoidable tension. The Sahel had known this pattern before, where assistance arrived wearing masks and left before accountability could catch up. The region needed training, equipment, logistics, knowledge. But it also needed clarity, legitimacy, and the confidence that the structures defending its people were aligned with the will of the state, not drifting beyond it. As the months passed, the contradictions deepened. Some commanders welcomed the expertise that these quiet figures brought. Others whispered unease about depending on actors who answered to distant agreements rather than national oversight. Even civilians, grateful for temporary order, wondered whether shadows could ever be a foundation for long-term stability. Then came the turning point, not delivered through an announcement, not unveiled by any government, but felt like a shift in the air. A fracture appeared within the very network that sustained these operations. A leadership crisis far from the Sahel sent shockwaves through the ranks. Suddenly, the structure that had moved with such confidence began to flicker. What was once a discrete constant became an uncertain question, and when uncertainty enters a security landscape already stretched thin, every capital from Bamako to Niamey feels the tremor. The Sahel braced itself. Old arrangements no longer held. New configurations were rumored. Diplomats whispered of negotiations. Analysts spoke of a coming transition. Communities felt the pause, a silence filled with expectation rather than fear, because when a force built in shadows begins to dissolve, something else must inevitably take its place, and the question lingered. If the old presence was fading, what form would the new one take? When the transition began, it did not arrive with fanfare, it arrived with insignias. Across the Sahel, the disappearance of old symbols was followed, almost immediately, by the appearance of new ones. Clear, formal, carrying the authority of a state rather than the ambiguity of a private network. Uniforms shifted, patches changed. Convoys that once traveled quietly now moved with a different posture, as if stepping out from behind a curtain into the open light. The transformation was subtle at first. Observers noticed the colors. Journalists noted the language used in official briefings. Security analysts pointed to a new structure, one housed not in the shadows of deniable operations, but within the command of a national ministry thousands of kilometers away. A name began circulating through reports and diplomatic cables: Africa Corps. The phrase signaled something more than a rebranding. It represented a shift in ownership, from a network that lived between legality and obscurity to a formation claimed publicly by a state whose global ambitions had long outgrown its regional borders. Where the previous presence was defined by silence, this one carried a voice. Where the earlier model operated in the margins, this one walked into official meetings, appeared on camera, and acknowledged its role. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, the change was felt almost immediately. Local officers described the newcomers as more structured, more openly integrated into the command of their host nations, and more closely aligned with diplomatic channels. The tone shifted from arrangements to agreements, from whispered coordination to documented cooperation. Training sites began to look different. Where instructors once arrived in unmarked vehicles, they now carried badges and documentation. Where sessions once took place under a veil of informality, they now operated under a schedule, a framework, and a line of accountability. The transformation did not erase the controversies, nor did it resolve deep-rooted tensions across the Sahel, but it did redefine the nature of the partnership. Governments saw the change as an opportunity to reclaim narrative control. For years, the presence of the earlier formation had drawn speculation, criticism, and accusations from abroad. Now, with a force openly tied to a sovereign state, leaders in the region could present the relationship as legitimate, a bilateral cooperation rather than a reliance on a shadowy contractor. Diplomats emphasized state-to-state ties. Ministers spoke of technical support, training, and strategic coordination, and yet, beneath the surface, complexity remained. For some officers, the new formation's arrival promised stability. For the first time, they were dealing with a partner whose mandate was clear, whose chain of command was public, whose operations aligned with formal agreements rather than opaque arrangements. It felt easier to plan, easier to coordinate, easier to integrate. But others hesitated. They remembered the stories. They remembered the controversies attached to earlier deployments. They understood that a uniform bearing a state's insignia does not automatically guarantee transparency, accountability, or alignment with local priorities. A village elder in the north expressed it simply: when the wind changes direction, you do not know yet whether it carries rain or dust. That statement captured the mood across many communities. Hope mixed with caution. Recognition mixed with uncertainty. The region had learned, through hard experience, that foreign actors, whether private groups, international missions, or state-backed formations, rarely acted without layers of interest. Still, the new posture mattered. Africa Corps was not operating in the shadows. It was announced. It was acknowledged. It stood alongside national forces in photographs, in briefings, in diplomatic discussions. Its existence signaled a broader shift. The Sahel was no longer relying on transitional solutions, but on a power willing to formalize its footprint. The symbolism grew stronger as additional units, advisors, and technical teams appeared. Workshops were held. Joint patrols were discussed. Strategic plans were drafted between delegations. The region watched the partnership evolve from uncertainty into something approaching structure. Yet structure alone does not guarantee success. The Sahel's vastness, its fragmented communities, its network of armed groups, and its unpredictable terrain all impose demands that no external force can fully meet. And so the arrival of Africa Corps raised a deeper question. Would this new formation be a stabilizing anchor or merely the next chapter in a long line of external actors cycling through Sahel's crises? As the months passed, one truth became clear. The shift from the old model to the new was not simply a change of uniforms. It was a change in strategy, a recalibration of influence, a declaration of intent, a signal that the relationship between the Sahel and its foreign partners was entering a more formal, more visible, and more consequential stage. The region held its breath, aware that every transformation carries both promise and burden. And in the quiet between transitions, a single question grew heavier. If a new force had stepped into the light, what new map would it draw across the Sahel? The Sahel had long lived inside a map drawn by others. Lines of assistance came from distant capitals, missions rotated in and out, policies shifted faster than the seasons, leaving communities unsure which partner would stand with them from one year to the next. But as the earlier formation dissolved and Africa Corps stepped forward, the region sensed something larger than a simple replacement. It felt like a reordering, a deliberate effort to reshape not only who provided security, but how that security was imagined. The first fault line in this transformation appeared in Mali, when officials announced that the previous force had completed its mission and withdrawn. The statement felt both final and symbolic. For years, that presence had operated as a constant, filling gaps left by exhausted national armies and departing international missions. Its withdrawal left a silence, and in that silence the shape of the new arrangement emerged. Africa Corps remained, not in secret, not in fragments, but as the visible continuation of a strategic commitment. Where the old structure blurred the boundary between public and private, the new one affirmed its identity, state-linked, uniformed, declared. From there, the shift rippled outward. Niger recalibrated its alliances, evaluating which actors could deliver the greatest stability during a period of internal transition. Mali deepened its cooperation with the newly arrived formation, integrating advisors into training programs and logistical work streams. And in the center of this restructured architecture stood Burkina Faso, navigating its own path through uncertainty, aligning itself with the broader push towards regional autonomy. For the first time in years, the Sahel witnessed a degree of coordination that did not originate from multinational coalitions or distant institutions. It came from its own capitals. It came from a shared decision. If external partnerships were inevitable, then they would no longer be fragmented or improvised. They would be consolidated into a system that the region itself could shape. This ambition crystallized in the creation of a joint force, an interlinked structure binding three nations into a single defensive posture. 5,000 personnel, unified planning frameworks, shared command considerations. The symbolism mattered as much as the substance. The Sahel wanted to speak with one voice, not as isolated states struggling on separate fronts. Africa Corps did not stand above this emerging arrangement. It stood beside it. Its personnel appeared in training grounds where different national uniforms mingled. Its advisors participated in exercises designed not for one country, but for a collective vision of security. Its presence shifted from merely supporting individual governments to engaging in a broader regional project. This new configuration created a sense of possibility. For once, the region was not waiting for external missions to define strategies or timelines. It was generating its own agenda, inviting partners into structures it had designed. And yet the Sahel understood that every new system carries its own vulnerabilities. The joint force relied on political cohesion, a rare commodity in a region where alliances have historically shifted with the smallest tremor. The operational demands were immense. Coordinated logistics across vast distances, communication systems capable of linking remote units, command teams able to harmonize doctrine, and local populations willing to trust that this new architecture was built with their safety in mind. The arrival of Africa Corps added both reassurance and complexity. Reassurance because the region now had a partner willing to formalize its footprint and contribute to capacity building in a structured way. Complexity because reliance on any single partner carries the risk of over-dependence, a lesson the Sahel had learned through years of shifting allegiances. In remote villages, conversations reflected this duality. Some residents welcomed the stability that seemed to follow new deployments, the increased presence at checkpoints, the revived confidence among local units. Others wondered whether the Sahel was trading one form of external reliance for another, changing the color of a uniform without changing the underlying dynamic. The new map was bold, but bold maps must prove themselves on the ground. As the joint force began coordinating across borders, as Africa Corps integrated more deeply into training cycles, as regional leaders spoke of sovereignty and self-determined security, the Sahel stood at a crossroads. Its old arrangements had collapsed. Its new architecture was still being built. Its foreign partnerships had shifted from shadowed contractors to formal state-backed alliances. But the question persisted in every corridor of every ministry, in every briefing room where officers gathered around flickering screens, in every village where people measured change, not by ceremonies, but by the calm of each passing night. If the region was drawing a new security map, who would have the courage and the authority to decide what should be written on it next? Beyond the borders of the Sahel, the world watched the transition with a mix of caution, calculation, and quiet curiosity. In distant capitals, analysts tried to understand what the arrival of a state-linked formation truly meant. Was it a simple continuation of earlier arrangements, or was it evidence of a deeper realignment? One where old partners lost their footing and new actors stepped into the vacuum. Across European policy circles, the tone shifted noticeably. For years, the region had been framed through the lens of counter-instability missions, development assistance, and broad multilateral programs. Now, the conversation had changed. Officials began speaking of strategic competitiveness, of new realities, of the need to rethink engagement in a region no longer guided by the frameworks once considered standard. Some voices argued for a return to stronger diplomatic initiatives. Others said the Sahel should no longer be treated as a stage for broad interventions, but as a collection of sovereign states choosing their partners on their own terms. And beneath that debate lay an uncomfortable realization. Whatever influence Western institutions once assumed, it could no longer be taken for granted. Across the Atlantic, the discussion grew more complex. Observers in Washington saw the transition as part of a wider pattern, a sign that regions once shaped by long-standing partnerships were now charting their own trajectories. Think tanks published careful assessments. Committees requested updated evaluations. Yet the overall response remained cautious. A recognition that bold action carried risks and that misreading the moment could deepen the distance already forming. Meanwhile, in North Africa and the Gulf, the shift was viewed through a different lens altogether. Algeria worried about instability drifting closer to its borders. Morocco watched the new alignments with interest, especially as regional connectivity and influence became central to its own ambitions. Gulf states evaluated the long-term implications, calculating how shifting alliances could reshape trade, investment, and security corridors linking Africa to the broader world. But the most telling reactions came not from policymakers, but from scholars and elders who had lived through earlier chapters of global rivalry. They recognized the pattern, a region caught between competing narratives, each promising stability, each carrying its own expectations. Their reflections carried weight. They remembered how easily the balance of power could tilt and how quickly promises of protection could become tools of influence. They understood the stakes because they had seen similar crossroads before, in times where external interests shaped the fate of entire nations. For them, the emergence of a new partner was neither victory nor defeat. It was a signal, a marker of a world where alliances shifted, where old frameworks faded, where new actors tested their reach. And beneath all the commentary, one truth hung in the air. If the world was recalibrating its view of the Sahel, what weight would this shifting gaze place upon the region's next decision? The Sahel now stands at a threshold, one shaped not only by new uniforms and formal agreements, but by the weight of choices that will echo far beyond the present moment. In every capital across the region, documents are being drafted, training schedules are being rewritten, bilateral committees meet behind closed doors to align expectations and responsibilities. There is a sense of momentum, as though the region is attempting to weave together a fabric strong enough to withstand the winds that have torn through it for years. The new formation brings structure. It brings expertise, equipment, logistics, and clarity where ambiguity once lived. But structure alone cannot resolve the deeper questions that define the region's struggle. Those questions are older than any partnership, older than any mission, older even than the borders that now carve the Sahel into states. How will regional cooperation hold when political pressures rise? How will joint forces operate when their priorities diverge? How will communities judge success? By quiet nights or by promises delivered in distant capitals? To answer those questions, the Sahel must confront its own history. For decades, solutions were imported, frameworks were borrowed, timelines were imposed. Each time, the region adapted, but rarely did it lead from within. The emergence of a regional security architecture is therefore not only strategic, but symbolic, a declaration that the Sahel is no longer willing to be defined solely by the agendas of external actors. Yet ambition carries responsibility. The joint force must prove it can operate with cohesion rather than rivalry. Governance must evolve to support a security structure that does not fracture under pressure. Communities must feel protected, not merely observed by shifting uniforms. The partnership with the new formation will also demand calibration. Engagement must be careful, balanced, aligned with national priorities rather than shaped by foreign calculations. The region has learned, often painfully, that no external presence, public or private, can substitute for institutions rooted in the soil they serve. And within this moment lies an opportunity. If the Sahel can transform formal cooperation into genuine stability, if it can blend external support with internal legitimacy, if it can align its security architecture with the aspirations of its people, then this chapter may become more than a reaction to crisis. It may become a turning point, a moment where the region begins to shape its future with its own hands. But the opposite is also possible. If coordination falters, if reliance deepens without accountability, if partners define the agenda more than the region itself, then the promises of this new arrangement may dissolve into yet another cycle of dependency. These choices will not be made on paper. They will be made in the silences between decisions, in the negotiations unseen by cameras, in the trust or doubt of communities who have watched many cycles rise and fall. And beneath it all sits the unanswered question that shadows every town, every barracks, every border post. If the Sahel has stepped through a new doorway, does it lead towards sovereignty? Or simply into another room built by someone else? The Sahel has walked through many formations. Some arrived loudly, some disappeared quietly, some claimed to bring order, Others promised renewal, yet few stayed long enough for their footprints to become part of the land. Now, a new architecture stands before the region, built from state-to-state agreements, joint commands, and partnerships dressed not in shadows, but in formal insignias. Its shape is clearer, its purpose more defined, its future still uncertain. In the heart of this turning stands a leader whose voice has stirred both hope and hesitation. When Ibrahim Traore speaks of sovereignty, he speaks not only to ministries and commanders, but to elders who have lived long enough to see promises broken more than once. He speaks to a people who know that foreign presence, whether declared or discreet, is never neutral. And he speaks to a continent that has carried too many stories written by someone else's hand. For Burkina Faso, this moment is more than geopolitical transition. It is a test of vision, a test of character, a test of whether alliances can truly serve the people who stand at the center of every headline the world debates from afar. If the region can turn cooperation into capability, if it can blend external support with institutions rooted deeply in its soil, if it can guard its autonomy even while accepting assistance, then this chapter may become the beginning of something long imagined but seldom seen. But if new uniforms simply replace old ones, if agendas are shaped abroad rather than at home, if expectations outrun accountability, then the era ahead may echo the cycles the Sahel has struggled to escape. The responsibility is immense, the choice is sharper than ever, and the silence between decisions grows heavy. In that silence, one truth emerges. Sovereignty is not declared in speeches, it is proven in the structures a nation builds for itself. And so another question rises, carried by the horizon, waiting for an answer that only the people can give. As new partners arrive and old arrangements fade, will the course charted by Ibrahim Traore lead to a security rooted in dignity, or merely to the next chapter of uncertainty? Stay with this story. Its next chapter belongs to all of us.